All right. Hi, I'm Frank. I'm covering for Dad tonight. My background is mainly maritime, so you're going to be getting a lot of that tonight. One of the things to remember is that World War II was primarily a maritime war. Even with all of the ground fighting on the Eastern Front, the Western Front of Europe, all of the ground fighting that went on in Asia, the majority of World War II was determined by control of the sea. And you'll see that as we progress through the war, the entire way through to 1945. The roots of World War II have their rise in the ashes of World War I. Germany and Italy in particular felt especially Germany, because they had been defeated, felt that they had been given the short end of the stick by the Versailles Treaty much more than was justified. And this led to a rise in national pride, a desire to see their country rise again, and this was shared by other countries around the world, namely Italy, who felt that they'd helped win World War I. They'd been fighting the Austrians in the Adriatic around that area, and they didn't get as much from the peace treaties as they were hoping to. And in the case of both these countries, that led to the rise of popularity of fascist dictators and allowed Benito Mussolini in Italy and then Adolf Hitler in Germany to come to power. In Japan, the military was already fairly well established as a political force, but well before either of the European fascist powers came to power. The Japanese had always been a very militaristic society, and that continued through the 1940s, and you even still see some of it today. The important thing to take away here, though, is that the military in Japan was split into two factions, the Army and the Navy. And each of them had very different views on how Japan should be proceeding with their foreign policy. Both had expansionist ideals. Both wanted to see Japan prosper, but the Army had less realistic ideas about Japan's capabilities. And that's going to be putting it mildly. All three of what would become eventually the Axis powers suffered from a distinct lack of resources. None of them had indigenous oil reserves. Japan had very little in the way of any raw materials. They had no good iron, so they couldn't make good steel from at home. They imported almost all of their manufacturing capability. Germany was probably the best off of the three, but even then they were still in the need of importing a lot of materials that they would need to wage war. All of them were looking to expand territory. They wanted to. All had some delusion of being the superior race. They wanted to expand their population at the expense of others. Italy wanted to make the Mediterranean its playground again in the veins of the old Roman Empire. Germany was looking to expand particularly into Eastern Europe to take over what it saw as infested lands there that they could purge and make into expanded Germany. And Japan was looking at a policy called Hako Ichiu. That's the 8 corners of the world under one roof, namely the Japanese roof. I know Dad's talked to you about the early 30s. The real kickoff for World War II was 7 July 1937, where the Japanese exchanged fire with Chinese troops in the Marco Polo Bridge incident. This is what is seen as the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and this this war is the first stage of the active part of World War II. As more and more conflicts around the world erupted concurrently, they would all become part of World War II. So the Japanese initially had some very major successes in China. They were able to expand into China from along the coastal region. The Japanese Navy played a major role in landing and then supporting the Japanese Army in these coastal regions. And this would also give the Japanese an early edge later on in the Pacific War, because it gave them valuable combat experience that a lot of the other major powers, namely the United States, did not have. Shifting back over to Europe for a minute, Italy took over Abyssinia in 1935, what is now Ethiopia. They also managed to expand their territories in northern Africa. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out. This was basically, it served the same function as the Second Sino-Japanese War, but for the European powers. Germany, Italy, and Russia all sent combat advisors, volunteer troops, which were actually units of their militaries that were sent there to, test out, see how their equipment was stacking up against foreign nations, and how everyone else's military equipment was doing. The Spanish Civil War lasted until 1939. It saw the nationalists under Franco come out on top, and Spain was a semi-ally of Germany, particularly Germany. They would often feed them tidbits of intelligence, but they refused to join in on the main event in 1939. They were still kind of rebuilding after 3-4 years of bloody civil war. In 1938, Germany first annexed Austria, and then was given the Sudetenland, which is a ethnically German section of Czechoslovakia, in an attempt to appease them, basically stop them from trying to annex any further areas of Europe. Basically, okay, you can have this, you're done. Didn't work. In early 1939, they annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia, basically using unrest as a excuse to go in and stabilize the region. And then in September, what is typically seen as the main start of World War II kicked off when Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September. The invasion of Poland was the trigger for the main fighting in Europe. France and England had both promised Poland that if Germany invaded, they would declare war on Germany, which they did on the 3rd of September. Although Unfortunately, their declaration of war didn't do a whole lot because they kind of just sat there. They took their time to build up forces. France was already in position. They neglected to attack. And Poland was then also, 2 weeks later, was also invaded by Russia. Germany and Russia had made a secret pact where they would split Poland. But even so, Poland held out until mid-October, and even then, they never formally surrendered. Which gives them the distinction of being the only country invaded by Germany that did not surrender. That is during World War II, but anyway. So, in the wake of the conquest of Poland, the Russians were feeling pretty good about things, and they decided that they were going to go ahead and bully Finland around a bit. This did not go as well. From the declaration of war on Finland until about March of 1940, the Russians were predominantly getting their butts handed to them, despite an overwhelming superiority in numbers. The Finns were better trained, not better equipped, but definitely better motivated and knew their home country far better than the Russians did. And that ended up being a bit of a embarrassment internationally for the Soviets, and also led to Germany underestimating them in the summer of 1941, which we'll see coming up in a bit. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, was going on what's called the Phony War. Basically, that was France and England were sitting around looking at Germany. Germany was sitting around looking at France and England, and nothing was really happening, except they'd occasionally throw a bit of ordnance at each other or drop some leaflets from aircraft. What Germany was doing was learning from its mistakes in Poland and refining its tactics of blitzkrieg, the lightning war. And when they finally invaded Belgium, Holland, and France in May of 1940, they were much better prepared, and in just 6 weeks, they managed to kick the British Expeditionary Force off the continent, and the French capitulated. In June, the British managed to execute a masterful evacuation, saving most of their troops from the beaches of Dunkirk, and were able to continue fighting. However, at the same time, Italy joined the war on the side of Germany. So this now left the Brits in a bit of a pickle. They were the only power in Europe fighting against the Germans and the Italians. They had, of course, their empire, the Commonwealth, to support them, but it took some time to be able to shift troops from around the globe into areas where they could help out in Europe. In the meantime, the Germans attempted to bomb England into submission, but by the time that they were actually managing to weaken the British, Brits had started doing bombing runs on Germany, which angered Hitler, and he ordered a change in targets. Instead of attacking military targets, the Luftwaffe now attacked civilian targets. And the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force, was able to recover, counterattack, and ultimately defeat the German aerial raids. Meanwhile, the Japanese invaded Indochina, now Vietnam. At the time it was a French colony, in September of 1940. They were looking to expand their control of the region, help secure their sea lanes between the home islands and the natural resources that had their eyes on in the Southeast Pacific. This drew some protests from, particularly from the Americans, but at that point we weren't really inclined to actively intervene. At least the population in general wasn't. Things more or less continued along like this until early 1941. Mussolini decided to go ahead and invade Greece. That went horribly for him, and the Germans had to divert troops down to bail him out. This delayed Hitler's main objective, which was finally launched on 22 June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of the Soviet Union. Like I had mentioned before, with Finland had managed to rather embarrass Russia on the international stage, and everyone at that point was underestimating the Russians. Hitler was so confident that Russia would crumble quickly that he didn't bother to issue his troops winter uniforms. By October, this was becoming more and more obvious as a mistake as things started to cool off, and by December, the German offensive had ground to a halt within sight of Moscow. About the same time that the Germans launched Barbarossa, the Japanese aggression in the Pacific, particularly in China, had finally gotten on pretty much everyone's nerves. In mid-1941, a major embargo was placed on Japan, both by the United States and the United Kingdom, the Dutch, the French, mainly on oil. The United States also placed an embargo on scrap metal exports to Japan. This put the Japanese in a bit of a pinch. They weren't going to be able to continue their operations in China without access to oil and metal to make weapons. So they would have to either pull back so that people would lift up the embargoes, or they'd have to go find new sources of oil. And they started looking south, particularly at the oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. In December of 1941, the Japanese launched major attacks throughout the Pacific, starting on December 7th, 1941, with an attack on Pearl Harbor, which badly mauled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, though it did not put it out of action like Japan was hoping it would. In particular, they did not attack the oil storage facilities or repair docks at Pearl Harbor, which allowed the U.S. to quickly put its fleet back into action. Simultaneously, they began attacks on the Philippines, Guam, Hong Kong, Wake Island, various strategic bases across the Pacific that fell fairly quickly. The Philippines managed to hold out until May. Meanwhile, the Japanese invaded and conquered British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. Back in Europe, things started to thaw out, and the Germans began a new offensive, this time concentrating in the south of Russia. The idea was to cut off the Caucasus oil fields from the Soviets, take them over and use them themselves. However, things started going a little too well for the Germans. Hitler got cocky and made another fatal mistake, splitting off one of his armies to go and head straight for the oil fields. This left the other armies vulnerable, and one of them got encircled in a bloody siege at the city of Volgograd. Stalin decided to rename it after himself, so the city of Stalingrad was declared a key point and was hotly contested, with the German army imprisoned there, finally surrendering in December. Alright. Up till now, we've been concentrating kind of on the land actions, but as I said, World War II was primarily a war for control of the shipping lanes. And we saw this most played out in the Atlantic. With the opening of hostilities in September of 1939, Germany began a campaign to destroy particularly British shipping because the British needed to, being an island nation, needed to import a lot of foodstuffs, a lot of materials, and if those could be cut off, then the British would have to withdraw from the war. The Battle of the Atlantic saw widespread use of submarines, like it had in World War I, and unfortunately for the Allies, they'd forgotten a lot of the lessons they had learned from World War I, fighting the U-boats then, and had to relearn them. Particularly the Americans were extremely slow to adopt convoy tactics, or even something as simple as blacking out city lights at night along the eastern seaboard, which made the ships sailing along there beautifully illuminated targets for the U-boats that the Germans sent against them. Operation Drumbeat, the attacks on shipping along the American coast, proved devastating, and were finally able to convince the Americans, oh, yeah, I guess we do need to get our act together. All right. And by June of 1942, the convoys and blackouts have been implemented along the American coast. The Germans also employed a significant number of heavy surface warships as long-distance raiders. Most famously, you had the Atlantis, which is a disguised merchant ship, and the heavy cruiser Admiral Graf Spee, which was caught after sinking some 22 ships in the South Atlantic. She was caught by 3 British cruisers and forced to scuttle herself during the Battle of the River Plate. There was also the infamous chase of the Bismarck, which was largest German battleship ever completed. She deployed in May of 1941 through the Denmark Strait, managed to sink the British battlecruiser HMS Hood, but then was caught and sunk by the Royal Navy a few days later. The Battle of the Atlantic was pretty well a seesaw battle through about May of 1943. At that point, the Germans started suffering horrendous losses, and the Allies were, while it was still a battle of attrition, the Allies were still dominant from that point on, and able to bring enough troops and supplies over to Europe to be able to prepare for invasions and landings in support of other operations. The Japanese suffered their first setback in May of 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea. In attempts to land troops in the south of New Guinea, from where they could threaten Australia, they were intercepted by a U.S. carrier task force, and we had the first carrier versus carrier fleet fight in history. However, this was less a victory for carriers and more a victory for U.S. intelligence. Before World War II, the U.S. had developed a strong intelligence gathering capability and broken a lot of the Japanese codes. And these let them start predicting where Japan was going to send its forces to strike next. This resulted in a tactical victory at tactical draw, strategic victory at Coral Sea, and then a month later, at the Battle of Midway, it allowed the Americans to kill 4 Japanese aircraft carriers to the loss of only 1 of their own. This was, unfortunately for the Japanese, this was a victory that they could not afford to give to the Americans, and the loss of 4 carriers meant that their navy would never recover to its early war strength. This was followed in August by the Allied invasion of the Solomon Islands, specifically the island of Guadalcanal, where the Japanese were building an airfield to threaten the supply lines between the United States and Australia. The Solomon Islands turned into a meat grinder of a campaign, with both sides suffering heavy attrition to their forces. However, the Americans could afford to replace their losses where the Japanese could not. I think at this point it's a good time to talk about pre-war preparation and logistics. You noticed I was mentioning the Japanese were ill-prepared to replace their losses. Before the war, they had prepared for a short conflict, looking to score quick victories and force their enemies to sue for peace. Unfortunately for them, everyone else prepared for a long war. The Americans in particular were able to bring huge amounts of manufacturing capability online and just straight up outproduced their opponents. Japan, for example, between 1922 and 1945, completed 168 destroyers. Between 1941 and 1944, the United States completed 175 Fletcher-class destroyers alone. The most produced German armored vehicle of World War II was the Sturmgeschütz III, a self-propelled assault gun, which clocked in around 11,000 units produced. The United States and Soviet Union each produced over 50,000 of their primary main battle tank, the Sherman and the T-34, alone, never mind all their other vehicles. Most of the Axis nations were also looking at significant manpower shortages compared to their opponents. And they just couldn't afford the same losses that the Allies could. So basically, anytime anyone tries to tell you, well, if the Axis had just waited until 1944, and they would have been able to win the war, no, they could not have. For example, in Germany's case, they expected to have some 400 submarines in production or in service by 1944, in addition to, besides Bismarck Tirpitz, the battleships they did complete, 2 or 3 H-class battleships as well, which are basically the Bismarck class on steroids. Let's see. The British alone were going to have at least 4 new battleships of the Lion class, which would have already outclassed Bismarck and Tirpitz. The Americans were looking at the Montana class, which is going to be another 5, which would have dwarfed the H class. Besides that, there were a number of other fleet carriers that they would have had in service. Several hundred more destroyers had already been begun in response to Axis buildup, and as far as I can tell, the argument of the Axis would have won if they'd waited till 1944 assumes that the Allies built absolutely nothing. So, no. Nice try. All right, back to the actual history here. November of 1942, the Allies launch Operation Torch. This is the invasion of French North Africa. It's a American-British landing in what is now Morocco and Algeria. And this is intended to both give a second front to help pull pressure off the Soviets, as well as give bases for further control of the Mediterranean to try to knock Italy and eventually Germany out of the war. This leads to the securing of North Africa by early mid-1943, and severely putting a crimp on the control of the Mediterranean that the Italians had been able to exert up to that point. The Mediterranean had been a hotbed of action with frequent clashes between the British Royal Navy and the Italian Regia Marina since June of 1940. But as the Allies managed to pour more and more ships and other war supplies into the Med, they were able to force the Italians back into a much more defensive role. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the Americans finally managed to drive the Japanese out of Guadalcanal in February of 1943 and continued to advance up the Solomons. Fighting there continued to be a meat grinder of ships going down, so much that the waters around the Solomons soon became known as Iron Bottom Sound, just because of the sheer number of ships that went down there. All right. In July of 1943, while the Americans were securing the northern Solomons, the Allies invaded Sicily in the Mediterranean as the next step on knocking Italy out of the war. Took them about 6 weeks to secure the island, and then they landed on mainland Italy near Salerno in September. At this point, the Italians decided they had had enough. They kicked Mussolini out and officially surrendered to the Allies. Hitler had kind of anticipated this, and he launched the ironically named Operation Axis, where basically Germany took over the rest of Italy and continued fighting the Allies there. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Germans were poised to launch a huge offensive aimed straight at the Soviet middle. Unfortunately for them, the Soviets caught wind of this plan and fortified the ever-loving bejesus out of the region. This resulted in the Battle of Kursk, which is still to this day the largest land battle in history. The Soviets poured everything they had into the area. The Germans did the same, and after a month and a half, the Germans were finally forced to call things off with nearly 2 million dead. And that was basically the end of the Germans' ability to launch offensives on the Eastern Front. From there on, the Soviets had the initiative. The Soviets had been not only rebuilding their own army after the initial disaster of 1941, they had moved their factories back behind the Ural Mountains where the Germans couldn't get them. And they had also been receiving a lot of material aid from the British and Americans through Arctic convoys up around Norway and then into the ports of Archangel and Murmansk. These were hotly contested battles that saw heavy losses, especially early on, but they were instrumental in supplying the Red Army with material to defeat the Germans. All right. So, meanwhile, in November of 1943, the U.S. starts launching its Central Pacific campaign, starting with the island of Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands in November of 1943. The landings were, or the fighting on the island itself were pretty fierce. The landings were a bit of a catastrophe. Basically, everything that could go wrong did go wrong, but the Japanese fortunately were unable to prevent the landings. The Americans learned what they would need to do in the future to have more successful landings, and these lessons were not only applied to the Pacific but also to the European theater. In the meantime, down in South and Southeast Asia, the Japanese had successes early on, were giving way to bloody stalemate out in India and Burma. The British had been forced, after the loss of Malaya, back into the Indian Ocean and were unable to contribute any major forces to the region until they managed to secure more dominance in the European theater, particularly the Mediterranean. You'll remember the Italian fleet was giving them a good run in the Med, and after the Italian armistice in September, the British were able to start shifting large numbers of capital ships to the Indian Ocean to start attacking the Japanese there as well. These were, for the most part, limited to raids into the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and any other Japanese-occupied areas right on the fringe, usually the ones that were threatening Australia, but also the oil refineries that the Japanese had sought after in the Dutch East Indies in the first place. So, 1944, we've got fighting on the Eastern Front. Russia is still pushing Germany back. We have fighting in Italy, which is ground to a stalemate. There's a lot of fighting, particularly around Monte Cassino in Italy. And everyone's looking to try to break this stalemate. The Americans got a good ball rolling in the Pacific. They hit the major Japanese base at Truk in the Caroline Islands and were able to inflict a lot of damage to the Japanese there. Their submarines are going into town on the Japanese merchant fleet, inflicting heavy damage there, also taking out a few major warships along the way. But June 1944 is going to be the big month, possibly one of the most important months of the entire war. It starts with the Soviets launching Operation Bagration. This is a major offensive in the central part of the Eastern Front. Now it lasts from June until August of 1944, and that it makes Kursk look like a minor skirmish. They just slam everything they have into this operation, and just steamroll the Germans. On the 6th of June, over on the other side of Europe, the Americans, British, and Canadians land troops in Normandy, beginning the liberation of France. I say the Americans, British, Canadians, but there's, of course, other forces, the Free French, the Free Poles, lots of other Commonwealth nations are contributing. The main reason I singled out the Americans, British, and Canadians is that they were the ones who were assigned major beaches during Operation Overlord, what is commonly known as D-Day. This began the drive just sweeping down through France that would eventually push the Germans back into Germany. And then the other one, back in the Pacific, was the American invasion of the Marianas. Guam had been American protectorate since the Spanish-American War, and the Americans went in to recapture Guam, as well as also the major islands of Saipan and Tinian. The idea being they could use these islands as bases for their shiny new B-29 strategic bombers. From the Marianas, the B-29s could reach targets in Japan. They had already been bombing Japan from China since 1943, but the B-29s did not like the environment in China very well, and they figured out that the Marianas were going to be a much better environment to work them out of. This also saw the Japanese commit their remaining carriers to try to stop the invasion of the Marianas. By this time, they had lost almost all of their veteran pilots. A lot of their carriers were not at full capacity for aircraft, and the Americans now knew what they were doing, and this resulted in what is called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, officially the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where the Japanese lost some 326 aircraft to only 26 American aircraft being shot down. At this point, the Japanese carriers ceased to be a force in the Pacific War. The Americans didn't know that entirely, and this would come into play later in the year. That's called foreshadowing, folks. All right. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the Soviets were closing in on back in on Poland, where they had been in 41 before the Germans invaded, and the Poles decided that this was a good time to launch their own uprising against the Nazi occupiers. The Warsaw Uprising was launched on 2 August 1944 and went on into October. The objective was to liberate the capital of Poland, Warsaw, before the Soviets could get there and claim that they had done it. However, unfortunately for the Poles, they received no support from the other allies, and the Germans were able to finally suppress the uprising in October. About the same time, on the other side of Europe, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, an attempt to punch through into Germany through the Netherlands and Belgium. This was partially successful, got them a good chunk of the way into the Netherlands, but the Germans were able to put up enough resistance to stop the drive before it was able to complete its ultimate goal of bridging the Rhine. This would be followed in December of 1944 by a German counterattack of their own in an attempt to encircle the Allied armies in Belgium and the Netherlands, and ideally break up the Western Alliance, force them to sue for peace, and then they could turn their full might on, or what was left of it, on the advancing Soviets. Unfortunately for the Germans, this did not go so well. The Allies counterattacked and wiped out their forces in what is known as the Battle of the Bulge. And the resulting defeat pretty much left the door wide open into Germany. Meanwhile, in October of 1944, the Americans finally returned to the Philippines. They landed on the island of Leyte in October, right on the 20th, and the Japanese decided that they absolutely could not afford to lose the Philippines. This would sever them from the remaining oil production in the Dutch East Indies, and would effectively strangle any ability of theirs to continue to wage war. So they committed the remainder of their fleet, and in a series of battles, collectively known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese lost several cruisers, 3 battleships, almost all of the rest of their carriers, which were being used as decoys at that point, and a number of smaller ships, to the Allies losing a handful of destroyers and a couple of small carriers. At that point, the Imperial Japanese Navy was unable to launch any sort of offensive in a meaningful capacity again during the war. All right. The Philippines were secured by about March of 1945, which freed up the Americans to continue advancing across the Central Pacific. They landed on Iwo Jima in February. The idea there being they were going to use it as a base to fly escort fighters for the B-29 raids, also as an emergency airstrip for the B-29s. And then they went into Okinawa in April. Back in Europe, everyone was closing in on Berlin. The Western Allies had invaded Germany. The Soviets had almost encircled Berlin. Mussolini had been rescued by the Germans and made a puppet dictator in northern Italy. He was killed by Italian partisans on 28 April 1945. 2 days later, Hitler shot himself in his bunker in Berlin as the Soviets fought to take control of the city above. And Germany surrendered unconditionally on the 8th of May. Back in the Pacific, the Americans secured Okinawa in June and began in earnest attacking Japan with carrier and battleship bombardments against major facilities along the coast. The B-29 raids continued on Japanese cities, and this culminated in August with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. The first one on Hiroshima on the 6th of August, and the second one on Nagasaki on the 9th. The second one was prompted by the Soviet declaration of war on Japan on the 8th of August. The Americans saw the partitioning of Germany and didn't want the same thing happening with Japan. They largely saw the Pacific as their show, despite all of the other countries that were helping out: China, British Commonwealth, Filipinos, and everyone else. So the second bomb was an effort to speed the surrender of Japan to minimize the Soviet involvement. It worked. Japan surrendered on the 15th, and the formal surrender, ending the last fighting of World War II, was signed aboard the battleship USS Missouri on 2 September 1945 in Tokyo Bay. All right. So, in the aftermath of World War II, Germany was divided up between the Soviets, the Americans, the British, and the French. Each country received occupation zones in Germany. Berlin was divided up as well. The city was completely within the Soviet zone, but being the capital of Germany and therefore somewhat important, sections were given to each of the occupying powers. Japan was occupied by the United States. Some of its smaller islands up north were occupied and annexed by the Soviets, who still have control of them. Japan was given a new constitution, which outright forbade any aggressive actions, as well as forbidding the Japanese from building any aircraft carriers, which they are currently in the process of circumventing. Italy seems to have gotten off the lightest of the Axis powers. They weren't occupied. Partially because they changed sides after kicking out Mussolini. And on 24 October 1945, we had the formation of the United Nations. This was a wartime agreement by the Allied powers. It was an attempt to basically make a functional version of the old League of Nations that had come about after World War I, but which had proved to be completely impotent in dealing with international conflicts. So, by the end of it all, we were looking at about 60 million people dead from World War II. About 20 million military deaths between Europe and the Pacific, and about 40 million civilians killed. And of course, no discussion of World War II is complete without talking about some of the atrocities that were committed. You have the more commonly known ones, like the Holocaust, perpetuated by the Nazis in Europe. We're looking at 6 million Jews killed, along with other people that were deemed undesirable, gypsies, physically or mentally disabled, black people, basically anyone who wasn't a pure white Aryan. In Asia, you had the Japanese committing all manner of atrocities in China, notably the rape of Nanking, which in 1937, which you're looking at probably around 200,000 up to 2 million people killed. The Japanese were also well known for committing great mistreatment of prisoners of war and experimenting on people, notably in Manchuria, with various, I use the term medical loosely, but medical camps. Of course, on the Eastern Front, you had the Germans and the Soviets mistreating the hell out of each other. Basically, everyone was flaunting pre-war bans on the use of aircraft attacking civilian targets. You had the Germans attacking cities during the Blitz. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, just indiscriminately bombing cities. Both in Europe and in Japan. You had the use of the first use of intercontinental ballistic missiles with the German V2, the first cruise missiles with the V1 also attacking civilian populations. You had submarines violating a number of treaties with the practice of unrestricted submarine warfare, both in the Atlantic, the Pacific. During the Nuremberg trials, Admiral Karl Dönitz, the chief of the Nazi U-boat arm and leader of their entire navy during World War II, was being charged with on the grounds of crimes on the grounds of the unrestricted submarine warfare, and he was actually defended by American Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, who wrote a letter to the court saying, "Look, I was doing the exact same thing in the Pacific." But so that's about where I'm going to wrap up. If you have any questions, feel free to send them to me either through my dad or try emailing me directly at navaltheater@gmail.com. I'll try to answer them best as I can. I hope you found this useful, and good luck with the rest of the class.